My name is Ashley Jones, and the book I will be discussing is The Reproduction of Inequality: How Class Shapes the Pregnant Body and Infant Health, written by Catherine Mason and published in 2023. So, to start, let me explain the basic setup and procedure of the study. The interviews were conducted between the years 2009 and 2010, and the women were residents of two rather polar locations, the San Francisco Bay Area and an inland northern central region of Florida. The Bay Area was known for being up to date with all of the national food and health trends, and an overall very liberal city, even in an already democratic state. It also had state-level public health policies, such as emission regulations or no smoking indoors. The Florida region, however, had in place much laxer public laws, and the local cuisine was less organic, all-natural foods, and more casual drinking and dining out. It should also be noted that geographic differences are not heavily considered in this study, but rather it helped to create a more diverse sample size. For recruitment, the author, who I should mention is white and at the time did not have children, as this could potentially and unconsciously influence respondents' answers, went to many WIC meetings, which I will define and explain later, to meet low-income women. She also attended in-person and online mommy groups to find more upper-class women. The snowball method proved effective at getting more participants, as women would pass on the information to friends. And then lastly, the participants consisted of 70 women, 36 HH, 26 LL, and 14 mixed class. Now, what is HH and LL? So HH stands for high education, high income, and LL stands for low education, low income. High education was categorized as having a 4-year college degree or more, while low education meant not having that. Low-income women were eligible for WIC, which stands for Women, Infants, and Children, and is a federally funded program that provides free food and nutritional counseling to low-income women and children under 5. And it also should be noted, 50% of women will at some point in the United States use WIC funds, so it served as a pretty well divider between the upper and the lower class. These women fell into the first or second quintile for household income, while high-income women fell into the 4th or 5th quintile. And then, of course, not all women will fit into this category. So the mixed class consisted of high education, low income women, and then low education, high income women. Some notable distinctions were that the average age for HH mothers to have had their first child was 31, while for LL mothers it was 21. Mixed class mothers fell in between at 28. 26 out of the 30 of her HH mothers were white, 12 out of the 26 LL mothers were black, 10 were white, and 4 were Latina. All of the HH mothers were married and lived in single-family households with their husband and their children. Here are a few commonly used terms that the author uses. So, reproductive body projects are the set of everyday body care practices women undertook to cultivate babies' development by working on their own maternal bodies during and after pregnancy. For healthism, some scholars have related it to religion almost, wherein the pursuit of health is a moral obligation to which people must repeatedly demonstrate their devotion. This essentially refers to the process where people look at health as an achieved morally superior status. Lastly, maternal embodiment is the period when the parent's body is directly staining the life of a fetus or a newborn, so pregnancy, childbirth, and breastfeeding in this case. The first focus she narrowed in on were sources of knowledge. HH mothers often sought advice and support through horizontal relationships, with both peers and healthcare professionals who shared their values. Many of the HH mothers would describe their heaps of research, whether it be from academic studies, popular books, magazines, or medical providers. This process involved gathering as much information as possible, and then deciding a safe route that would fit their personal beliefs. They tended to be up to date on health and parenting practices and trends, and this worked to subconsciously assert their moral status as health experts. HH mothers often felt more confident to challenge medical authority and were less likely to reach out to their own mothers as much, describing them as from a different generation, with more traditional views. Instead, peers were the most common source of information, chosen communities where women could find affirmation and identity. On the other hand, LL women are more likely to rely on vertical relationships through medical professionals and their mothers, putting their faith in people with more experience and knowledge than themselves. They often judge themselves or were judged by others as having insufficient knowledge. LL women also frequently look to their own mothers, as around half of them lived with extended family already. Mixed-class women who had a higher education but were eligible for WIC seemed to distance themselves from their fellow WIC participants, aligning more with the staff and working to create that horizontal relationship. LL mothers were also way less likely to cite peers as useful sources of support and emotional connection and reliability were the attributes these women described in ideal friends rather than sharing parenting philosophies. Overall, class and cultural groupings significantly shaped women's notions of which health and body care practices were optimal, while material opportunities and constraints influenced which practices were possible. The next difference that was examined was the risk-avoidant paradigm, which seeks to promote child well-being at all costs and minimize any potential risk, while the risk-assessing paradigm entails women acting as informed consumers of health information and calculating decisions for what best suits them and their children. This approach involves educating oneself to be able to evaluate risks and make decisions based on that information. Risk avoidance involves removing anything that could in any way detriment the child, staying away from certain foods or experiences, breastfeeding as long as possible. It was also the dominant stance, and those who opt for more risk-assessing behavior often feel the need to defend their choices to others. These paradigms relate heavily to the topic of breastfeeding. Both the WIC and the NIH, National Institute of Health, at this time heavily advocated for breastfeeding, encouraging mothers to make it at least a year to ensure the best outcome for their child. For mothers that fell more into the risk-avoidant mindset, this meant breastfeeding at whatever the cost. However, this often proves to be difficult for some mothers, as some stop producing milk fairly early, others it causes great pain, or there's medical complications from preventing them from participating, and for some, they simply cannot afford the time off work it can require to breastfeed a baby all day long. The risk-avoidant mothers will do whatever it takes to breastfeed for as long as they can, while risk-assessing mothers will more so consider their options when problems with breastfeeding arise, and then make the informed decision to switch to formula if that is what better suits them. The next topic was relating to how women across classes did or did not connect their body care choices during and after pregnancy to a larger sense of self-identity. HH mothers tended to use diet, exercise, and professional careers to claim identities as particular types of eaters, athletes, or accomplished professionals. Many treated it as a way to further develop their identity rather than viewing it as a disruption. In contrast, LL women frequently resisted making their self-care practices the basis for an identity and would practice disidentification. This involved accepting the value of mainstream health norms while still framing them as burdensome and distasteful. Mixed-class women fell into an interesting in-between, where they knew about what was recommended in the trending products but lacked the financial resources to obtain them. In Chapter 5, it was examined how changes in a mother's maternal body affected their sense of agency. HH women fell into the category of rigid agency, in which they felt like these changes represented a body out of control, and sought to reassert control over their bodies in what the author calls rigid agency. These were examples of some women in which they were not able to breastfeed as long as they intended due to medical reasons or lack of milk, and they felt like they had failed and took it very, very difficult. LL women, on the other hand, responded to twists and turns with flexible agency, in which they still made choices about what they wanted to do for their body and their children, but focused less rigidly on determining an outcome and more on flexibly negotiating different alternatives. The last chapter focused on how mothers' investments in their children and health and body care habits today might reproduce class inequalities later in life, a form of care the author terms status work. This is the idea about social reproduction, which social scientists deem as transmitting their own social status, culture, and resources onto their children. HH women discuss the importance of moderation to their children, exposing them to culturally diverse foods and not wanting them to develop the struggles with food that they themselves experienced. Where middle upper-class women aim to endow their children with sophisticated cosmopolitan tastes, poor and working-class mothers spoke about helping their children appear tidy and clean. LL mothers focus more on the concept of good versus bad food, with the former being fruits and vegetables and the latter processed and sugary foods. These ideals focused on simple, easy-to-follow rules, as opposed to HH mothers' hopes for informed consumption. This, of course, comes from class differences in which low-income families do not have the ability to constantly introduce their children to diverse foods, take their kids out to dinner and out of the country to experience other cultures, like many of the HH women discussed. LL mothers also distinctly discussed averting poor health conditions as a major priority. People lower on the socioeconomic scale are significantly more likely to have chronic illnesses like asthma, diabetes, hypertension, and this is a result of a combination of chronic stress, malnutrition, manual labor, exposure to environmental racism, inadequate health care. These women discuss not wanting their children to have the adverse health effects that they have or have seen, which was noticeably absent in the HH mothers list. Well, this book focuses on class differences. There are aspects that affect all women across class. Pregnant and women who have children, regardless of class, are often subjected to unsolicited advice and invasive comments about their body, as when it comes to pregnancy, many people feel like they can say what they want out of an effort to help. All women the author interviewed as well described how they were the ones to take on the bulk of the research and knowledge consumption when it came to nutrition, breastfeeding safety, and lastly is the act of noticing, which was the topic of chapter 2. Noticing a child's needs, tastes, and desires is what is societally expected of the mothers, as women are socialized to notice the needs of others, and fathers often ceded everyday health and nutrition decisions to mothers. There are, of course, also additional factors that play into a woman's maternal embodiment. Religion is a factor. For example, one woman was LDS, and so because of her religiously imposed health and diet restrictions, the transition to pregnancy was not much of a change. Her faith actually bolstered her ability to enact a normative reproductive body project. Another woman was a Hare Krishna, whose religious traditions were more at odds with mainstream health recommendations. Immigrant mothers who had tied to other cultures were also more likely to call out how mainstream U.S. health norms were very culturally specific, not the universal standard. One woman discussed how, because of her Korean heritage, she planned not to go outside for the first 3 weeks after delivery. Poor and working-class Black women were also the most likely to disidentify with WIC-approved health norms and make particular changes to their diet. Overall, this book discusses how social class shapes nearly every aspect of pregnancy, from access to knowledge, to health practices, to maternal identity, to the ways children are socialized into future class positions. I personally found this book to be really interesting and very thorough, as there were a lot of specific stories and sayings from the woman that she interviewed that I didn't have room to include. Of course, a sample size of 70 women cannot be applied to every woman in the United States, but this book still provides a powerful look at how class structures influence pregnancy and reappear later in the child's life.